All right, Rabbi say good morning. Let us begin. Let's begin by thanking our sponsors for today's shir, to thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Cheshvan. Meir and Rachel Gold for dedicating all the shiurim this month. Le'iloi Nishmas Yonah Tzvi, Ben Yosef Chaim Elazar HaKohen, and Noam Leah Efron for dedicating all the shiurim and droshos this month in celebration of the 98th birthday of Noam's grandfather, Yosef Hershel ben Mordechai Halevi. Shebizochem Yirtz Hashem, to health and nachas from his mishpacha at neve esim shanim tovos. And to thank our week of learning sponsors, Mr. Morton Esterson and Malka and Samuel Esterson, in memory of Mrs. Miriam Goldfein, Miriam Bas Matitiyahu, beloved cousin of Mr. Esterson, Malka and Samuel Esterson. I'll just read this dedication because it's quite beautiful. Who passed away on the 8th of Cheshvan, just a few days ago, at the age of 99. Miriam did not have an easy life, but with it all, she was a kind and loving person and always happy with her lot in life. May she be a melitzah yisharah for our family and for all of Am Yisrael. And to thank our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, the Plunka family, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Rachel Imenu. Meretz Hashem, Mama Rachel should be an advocate for us on high. And the Meretz Hashem, the Rachel Mavaka Al Baneha, and Meretz Hashem, we should be zocha, that her tears should move HaKadosh Baruch Hu to send the Mashiach here, Rabbi Aminu. Amen. We'll see. With that, let us begin. So we have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is daf Ches. Thank you again to Rabbi Kamen Akiva for giving shir yesterday. We are going to pick up on Ches Amud Aleph at the 2 dots, which is 2, 4, 5 lines down. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omrin, Be'echad B'Tishrei. So we'll say, so if you remember again, we had an interesting machlokes in the Mishnah. And the machlokes in the Mishnah was when is it Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema? So very quickly, we learned this in yesterday's daf already. Meiser Behema is an obligation to tithe the flock each and every year. But obviously, again, the halacha in general by tithing is you're only supposed to tithe from what we'll call it the present cohort. So in order to determine what the present cohort is, of course, you need the beginning and the end of the year. So when's Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema? So with this, we had a machlokes. First opinion in the Mishnah said, Echad be'elul, first of Elul. Second opinion is Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, who we're going to discuss now, said, Echad b'Tishrei. So now we're going to focus on this second opinion. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, Omrim be'echad b'Tishrei is the Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema. So Rabbi Yochanan, U'shnei mikra echad dasher. So we'll say, so the shaila, of course, becomes, what is the nature of this machlokes? What are they arguing about? Whether or not Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema is the first of Elul, the first of Tishrei. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan says, both sides are darshaning the same pasuk. This is quite beautiful. A pasuk in Tehillim. David HaMelech writes, Lovshu Karim Hatzon. So we'll say, literally means, it means the sheep, Lovshu, are clothed in karim. So karim so we'll see, look at Rashi for just a moment. It's Rashi's right across. Love shu karim atzon, mikru b'sefer tilim. So Rashi says this is a pasuk in sefer tilim. Love shu karim atzon, va'amakim ya'atfu bar. I really should read the rest of the pasuk. Back to the Gemara for just a moment. Love shu karim atzon, which means the sheep have become clothed. Va'amakim ya'atfu bar, the valleys have become covered in fodder. Yisrael af yashiru. They shout out and they sing. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Right across. Love shukar matzon. Mikru b'sefer tilim. This is a pasuk in sefer tilim. Love shukar matzon v'amakim yatfu bar. Yisrael af yashiru. So Rashi just explains the first part of the pasuk. Love shukar matzon. What does that mean? That literally, again, the sheep have become clothed with karim. Mislapshos hakvasim. It means the sheep become clothed. Shemis abros. It means they become clothed with pregnancy. That's the metaphor. Love shukar matzon means the sheep become pregnant. The sheep become pregnant. So says the Gemara, let's analyze. Rabbi Meir Savar, Rabbi Meir is the Tanakama. Okay, so the Tanakama holds that when is the Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema? Elul, right? El was a 50-50, right? Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon hold that it's Tishrei. Tanakam Rabbi Meir holds that it's Elul. So Rabbi Meir Savar, Emasai lav shukarim atzon. When do the sheep become pregnant? Bisman sha'amokim ya'atfu bar. At a time that the valleys become covered, also with fodder means with vegetation. When do the valleys become covered with vegetation? Ve'emasai amokim ya'atfu bar. Ba'adar. ultimate spring in Adar. We write Adar is the beginning we often associate Nisan with the beginning of spring, but Adar already is at the time when we see vegetation begin to come forth. So when do the sheep become pregnant? When the valleys become covered with vegetation in Adar. Therefore, again, what do you see from here? Mis'abros ba'adar, the sheep become pregnant in Adar, the yoldos ba'av, and they go out and they give birth in Av, and therefore it makes sense, Rosh Hashana shalahan Elul, and therefore the new year for Meiser Behema will be Elul. So according to Rabbi Meir, here's the progression. Here's how you understand the pasuk. The sheep become pregnant when ultimately, again, when the valleys become covered with vegetation. When do the valleys become covered with vegetation? Adar, beginning of spring. Therefore, sheep become pregnant at the beginning of spring. They go ahead and give birth when? They give birth Av, and therefore Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema will be Elul. Okay? Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omrim. No, you have to read the pasuk a little bit differently. A Mosai love shukare matzon. Ultimately, again, when do the sheep become pregnant? Bisman sheyisro'o af yashiru. When the crops shout out and sing songs. So Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon jump to the end of the pasuk. Gemara is going to ask on this, but they link the beginning and the end of the pasuk to each other. Love shukare matzon. When do the sheep become pregnant? End of the pasuk, when the crops shout out and sing. When do the crops shout out and sing? When do the stalks go out and say shira? B'Nisan. In Nisan, because we'll say ultimately, again, remember, in Nisan is when that's the first stalks, which of course is barley, right? Barley is the first grain to mature, but that's when the stalks call out because they have ripened. Misabros b'Nisan, so that teaches me again, the sheep become actually pregnant in Nisan, not in Adar. The Yoldos be'elul, and therefore the timeline is pushed off a month. Therefore they give birth in Elul. Therefore Rosh Hashana shalahan Tishrei, and therefore the Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema ultimately again is going to be Tishrei. So we'll say what's interesting over here is, remember, there's only a month differential between these two opinions. V'idach, I what Rabbi Meir, v'idach nami haksiv Yisro'o af yashiru. But what does Rabbi Meir do with the phrase that says they will call out, they will shout out and sing? So the Gemara says, Hahu ba'afalta dahavyon b'nisan. So Rabbi Meir will agree, not all sheep become pregnant at the same time. So not all sheep become pregnant in Adar. The later ones to conceive during Nisan. The idach, what Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon do? Haksiv va'amokim yatfu bar. What do they do with the fact that the pasuk says, and the valleys will become covered with vegetation? Hahu bechar fiyasa. That refers to the sheep that became pregnant early. So again, everyone agrees that the sheep don't all become pregnant at the same time, but there's only really a 1 month window. The asyon me'adar. So b'shal Rabbi Meir, kedechsev lav shukare matzon. So both say the drasha of the pasuk makes more sense. So therefore, essentially what we have is two drashas, right? Lav shukare matzon. The sheep become pregnant. So Rabbi Meir will say, when do the sheep become pregnant? Just trace the progression of the pasuk. Va'amakim yatfu bar. When do the sheep become pregnant? When the valleys become covered with vegetation. When do the valleys become covered with vegetation? When? Adar. So they become pregnant in Adar. Give birth when? In Av. And ultimately Rosh Hashana will be Elul. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, and I both say, and then again, the rest of the pasuk according to Rabbi Meir, Yisro'o af yashiru, that refers to the sheep which become pregnant when the crops shout out in joy. And when do the crops, when does the grain, when does the stalks begin to shout out in joy? Nisan, there are sheep that become pregnant a little bit later on. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, they dash differently. They say, love should karim zone. When do the sheep are hatzon? When do the sheep become pregnant? They dash the end of the pasuk. Yisro'o af yashiru. When the crops call out in joy. Sheep become pregnant in Nisan. Give birth in Elul. Rosh Hashana will be Tishrei. What about va'amokim yatfu bar? That refers to the sheep which conceive earlier. So the Gemara says, Bishlam Rabbi Meir kidechsev, lav shukara matzon, bizman shamakim yatfu bar, v'iganami Yisro'o af yashiru. So we'll say the drasha of Rabbi Meir makes sense. Why? Because it goes in the order of the pasuk. the sheep become pregnant. When? Amakim yatfu bar, when the valleys become covered with vegetation, but there are some that become pregnant a little bit later when the crops call out in joy. El Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon, Ipchami Baile, Rabbi Shimon, they should darshan the pasuk. The pasuk is darshan out of order, right? According to them, the pasuk should have read how? It should have said, "Love shu karamatzon." The sheep become pregnant when bisman she yisra'o af yashiru. That's what the pasuk should have said. When do the sheep become pregnant? When the crops, when the stalks call out in joy. When do the stalks call out in joy? When? Nisan. And then it should have said, V'ikonami da'amokim yatfu bar. And then it said, oh, by the way, there are some that become pregnant earlier in Adar when the valley is covered with vegetation. So in other words, we're saying, what the Gemara is just pointing out over here is, the Drush of Rabbi Meir, the Tanakama in the Mishnah, reads as a straight progression in the pasuk. Beautiful. According to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, you dash in the first part of the pasuk, connect it to the second part of the pasuk, the last part of the pasuk, and then go back and dash in the middle of the pasuk. It's not a linear drasha. To which the Gemara says, "Ela Amar Rava," you're right. The Gemara says, "Ela Amar Rava, du kuli alma lav shakar matzon bizman she'amakim yatvu bar ba'adar." It will say, says Rava, that's not the machlokes. The machlokes ultimately again is not when the sheep conceive. Right? Everyone agrees when do the sheep. In other words, David HaMelech, I will say, is reflecting in this pasuk. He is speaking out a biological reality, and he's saying, "Love shukara matzon." When do the sheep become pregnant? What's the lashon? Love shukara matzon va'amakim ya'atfu bar. When the valleys become covered with vegetation. When do the sheep become pregnant? In Adar. Well, see, I just want to point out something very interesting over here. Isn't it fascinating that there's a machlokes and a pasuk about when sheep become pregnant? Right? You would think that lamaisa, this is not a machlokes in the pasuk. How do you figure this out? I don't know, like a sheep home pregnancy does. I don't know, however you do it, whatever you need to do. There are ways to figure this out. So we'll say, it is such an incredible, it turns out the Gemara says, you're right, it's not the machlokes. But I'll tell you something absolutely amazing. Do you know what it teaches us? The reality of a Jew is defined through the prism of Torah. You see, sometimes we think that reality is defined by how we perceive the things around us. My perception determines reality. That is not true for the Jew. My reality is determined by Torah. Now, are there different ways to perceive Torah? Absolutely. Which could result in different understandings of reality. But this is so incredibly important, because if reality is defined by how we perceive it, who says I'm perceiving reality through the correct lens? Who says I'm perceiving reality through a proper lens? That's why we pursue. It's amazing when Chazal argue, when do sheep conceive? And the machlokes is based on how you darshan a pasuk in Tehillim. It says that reality has to be perceived through the lens of Torah. Torah creates our reality. Our personal perception does not. Such an incredible yisod. The Gemara says, but you're right. They're not really arguing about sheep conception in a machlokes and a pasuk in Tehillim. Rather, Rava says, everyone agrees, when David HaMelech writes, Lav shukara matzon, va'amokim yatfu bar, David HaMelech is reflecting a reality. And the reality is, when do the sheep conceive? When the valleys are covered with crops, with vegetation. And when are the valleys covered with crops? When? Adar. Sheep conceive in Adar. Are there some late conceivers? Yeah, there are some late sheep that go ahead and conceive in Nisan. So the Gemara says, but so here they're actually arguing about a different pasuk. Listen to this. Aser to Aser. The pasuk says you should tithe. Aser to Aser is called to Azaracha. Hayotzi asada shana bashana. You should tithe. Now I will say, Aser to Aser, the Gemara darshans, Bishnei Maisros HaKosav Medaber. The Torah is referring to two different tithes. What are the two tithes? Echad Meiser Behema, Ve'echad Meiser Dagon. So we'll say, Aser to Aser, the Torah is referring to two different tithes, but interestingly enough, doing what? Linking them together. And here's the Shaila. How do you darshan the linkage? Here we go. Rabbi Meir Savar, Makish Meiser Behema La Meiser Dagon. Rabbi Meir, the Tanakama, will say, remember, keep the Shitas in line. What does Rabbi Meir hold? When is Rosh Hashana for Ma'aseh Behema? Rabbi Meir? Elul. Elul, right? Rabbi Elazar b'Shimon, ultimately again, Tishrei. Just write it down. Write it down. I will say, because remember again, this is important to keep these constructs. So ultimately, Rabbi Meir, I just want to point out, Rabbi Meir is the unnamed Tana Kama in the Mishnah. Right? Remember again, Stam Mishnah, Rabbi Meir. That's why it's not just we're bringing Rabbi Meir into this. He's the Tana Kama. So Rabbi Meir holds like this, that we compare Aser to Aser tells you that you compare Meiser Behema to Meiser Dagon. I will say Meiser Dagon is the general tithe that you take from your wheat. So the Gemara says, Ma Meiser Dagon, Samoch Legamro. We'll say, when do you take Meiser Dagon? When do you take Meiser from your grain? Ultimately, again, when the growth is completed. Samoch Legamro Isuro. Ultimately, again, when the crop is complete, is when we tithe it. Af Meiser Behema, Samoch Legamro Isuro. So too, again, by Meiser Behema. Ultimately, again, when it is completed is when we tithe it. Now, how does this translate practically? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi's almost right across. Meiser Dagon Samoch Legamro Isuro. So we'll say, remember again, when is the Rosh Hashana for Meiser Dagon? When is Rosh Hashana for Meiser Dagon? It's Tishrei. Rashi says over here, Rosh Hashana L'Meisros Tishrei Dahachi Tani Leila Kamon Bebraisa V'Tishrei Samoch Legamrohu. Now we'll say, now watch this. Why is Tishrei the Rosh Hashana from Meiser Dagon? Because Tishrei is right when the Dagon is completed. What does that mean? It's completed. So Rashi says, "Dechol yemos hachama manichim liyavesh begrano shebesado." So remember again, in the Eretz Yisrael agricultural season, what would you do? You would cut standing grain. You would begin to cut standing grain when? Pesach time with the Omer, right? But you would really continue through Shavuos, right? Shavuos is when they would harvest the wheat. What do you do after you harvest the wheat? You bundle it and you leave it in the field. You leave it in the field to dry out. When do you go ahead and bring it in? By Tishrei. How do we know this? What's Sukkis? Chag HaAsif. Right? It's the time when ultimately, again, you would be gathering the grain into your silos. It was sufficiently dried out, you grab it. So listen to this. Rabbi Meir will hold. Why Tishrei? Right? Meiser Dagon. The Rosh Hashana for Meiser Dagon, for again, tithing grain is Tishrei. Why? Because we set up the tithing date right when the crop is complete. So grain is finished by Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, and ultimately, again, therefore, Rosh Hashana for Meiser will be Tishrei. So too, the Gemara says, so too, we're going to say that halacha l'maisa when it comes to animals. I'm sorry, let's go back for just a moment. So ma meiser dagon samoch le'imor isura, af meiser behema samoch legamro isuro. That will say ultimately again, when are animals done? Right? Done means what? When they're birthed. So when is the new crop of animals normally completed, being birthed by Elul? Remember again, this is the earlier opinion, right? This is Adar. Ultimately, again, I will say, I just want to point out, forget what we learned before, right? Remember again, beforehand we were talking about that the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar b'Shimon is when do the sheep conceive, right? Do they conceive in Adar? Do they conceive in Nisan? Now the Rava said everyone agrees they conceive in Adar. If they conceive in Adar, they give birth by Av. Right? They give birth by Av, which then means Rabbi Meir will hold the Rosh Hashana should be Elul. Because by Elul, again, the new crop of animals, so to speak, is complete. Everything's been birthed. We've got our new cohort, and we're good to go. So that is the position of the Tanakama of Rabbi Meir. The Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema will be Elul. Why Aser to Aser says compare Meiser Behema to Meiser Dagon. Just like Meiser Dagon, Rosh Hashana is established by when the crop is finished. When is the crop finished? When it's finished, fully drying out of the field, you bring it in by the end of Elul, Rosh Chodesh Tishrei, Rosh Hashana for Meiser Dagon. So too, when is the cohort of animals fully birthed, the new cohort? By the end of Av. Therefore, Rosh Chodesh Elul will be the Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Savri, no, they disagree with this. They say it's simpler. Makish Meiser B'la Meiser Dagan. So we'll say, listen to this. They agree. See, here's what's interesting. Everyone is agreeing on the premise of the drasha, which is Aser to Aser comes to link Meiser Behema with Meiser Dagan. But listen to this. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon will say, we're going to make this hekish literal. And they'll say, so the Gemara says, Ma Meiser Dagan Rosh Hashana Shelo Tishrei Af Meiser Behema Rosh Hashana Shalo Tishrei. So I will say, ultimately, again, they take a literal understanding of this Rasha, and they'll agree, the Torah is linking Meiser Behema with what? With Meiser Dagan. And literally, just like Meiser Dagan is Tishrei, so too Meiser Behema is Tishrei as well. Both say pretty incredible. How do we paskin halacha l'maisa? We paskin like the second opinion, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, that halacha l'maisa, Rosh Hashana for Meiser Behema is echad b'Tishrei, the same thing as Meiser Dagan. Why? Because we accept this drasha. Aser to Aser links the two. Meiser Behema and Meiser Dagan are on the same exact date, i.e. the 1st of Tishrei. Beautiful. Let's go weiter. But also now we get into an incredible sugya. Says the Gemara, Be'echa b'Tishrei. There's so much to say about this also. Okay, good. We'll go weiter now. Be'echa b'Tishrei Rosh Hashana. But say next thing the Mishnah said, 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashana for years. Rosh Hashana for years. Says Gemara, my hilchasa. So what does that mean, Rosh Hashana for years? So it says the Gemara, Amra Papa l'shtaras. It has to do with the dating of documents. The dating of documents. So how do you know when it's the new year for dating of document purposes? 1st of Tishrei. The Gemara says, this nan, because we learned, Shtari chov hamukdamin psulin v'hamu charin ksherin. We learned pre-dated documents are pasul, post-dated documents are kasher. We'll say, sound familiar? Yeah, we had this on Beis Amud Aleph. This is the meaning of the Masechta, right? Why are pre-dated shtaros pasul? Why are they pasul? Because what can end up happening? You could defraud purchasers, right? You give the lender a prior lien, right, or a lien that exists prior to the loan, which is illegal, because you could end up defrauding people who bought unencumbered property by producing a document that shows that it was encumbered. But if you want to post-date a document, can you do that? Sure, because what does that do? It just delays the lien. So if the lender wants to do that, that's why he would want to do it, I don't know. But Lamaisa, if he wants to do it, that's his prerogative. So the Gemara says, 1 second. The Gemara says, 1 second, you already used this before. We learned before, opening statement in the Mishnah, that Rosh Hashana, right, at 1st of Nisan, is the Rosh Hashana for kings. And we said, and we asked there, Beis Amud Aleph, we asked, what does that mean that the 1st of Nisan is the Rosh Hashana for kings? What does that mean? And Rav Chisda said, for dating of documents. So I don't understand. So what's going on over here? So the 1st of Nisan is the Rosh Hashana for Malachim for dating of documents. 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashana for dating of documents. So what's happening over here? Lo kashya, not a problem. The truth is what it means is like this. Rosh Hashana, 1st of Nisan, Gemara kind of alluded to this already. The 1st of Nisan is how we would go ahead and keep track of the reign of Jewish kings. 1st of Tishrei is how we went ahead and kept track of the reign of non-Jewish kings. So they both have shtaros, they both have shtar document ramifications. But one has to do with Jewish kings, that's the 1st of Nisan. One has to do with the counting of the reign of non-Jewish kings, 1st of Tishrei. So the Gemara says, but 1 second. When Rav Chisda said before, when Rav Chisda said before, we had this Gemara before, Gimel Amud Aleph. Rav Chisda said before, when he wanted to reconcile the contradiction, he said, no, Nisan is only significant for the counting of the reign of Jewish kings, but we count the reign of non-Jewish kings by Tishrei. Says the Gemara, Rav Chisda, Mas Nisan Asalash Ma'inon, was Rav Chisda just coming to state something that was explicitly explained in a Mishnah? Lo Rav Chisda Kroy Asalash Ma'inon. Rav Chisda wanted to teach a pasuk. V'bai Sim Rav Chisda Rabbi Zera Masnila. Rabbi Zera Amar Litikufa. Rabbi said there is another opinion. Rabbi Zera says the 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashana for seasons. That the seasons ultimately again are reckoned by Tishrei. We'll come back to that and explain what exactly that means. The Gemara goes weiter. Rabbi Elazar, he da'amar b'tishrei nivra ha'olam, and reflects the view of Rabbi Elazar, because Rabbi Elazar holds that the world was created in Tishrei. We'll say this will be another major machlokes that we will get into. Where does the Gemara quote this from? We'll see this on 2 days from now. And Yonah Beis Meir Hashem, we'll see this about when was the world created. So we'll say, so we have a couple of different possibilities. Possibility A is that the 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashana for dating documents. for Jewish kings. Second possibility is, for non-Jewish kings, for non-Jewish kings. Jewish kings are first of Nisan. Second possibility is first of Tishrei, Rosh Hashana for seasons. And ultimately, again, that's in line with the view that says that the world was created in Tishrei. Come back to that. Both say, listen to this. Here we go. Beautiful, beautiful segment. Yitzchok Amar Lidin. Now, what does it mean when we say that the first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashana? It means it is the Rosh Hashana for judgment. For judgment. And I will say here we are introduced to this idea of Rosh Hashana as a Yom Adin D'chsiv. I will say, listen to this. The Gemara quotes the pasuk from Devarim, Meireshis Hashana V'ad Acharis Hashana. From ultimately, again, from the first of the year, V'ad Acharis Shana, till the end of the year. What does that mean? Meireshis Shana Nidon Ma Yehe B'sofa. In the beginning of the year, Meireshis Shana Ad Acharis Shana. Ultimately, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu determines what is going to happen through the end of the year. From the beginning of the year, HaKadosh Baruch Hu determines going to be, what I just point out to you, I've mentioned this drasha before, but the Satmar Rav, Zecher Tzaddik V'Kadosh Levracha, says something so beautiful. He says on this pasuk, Meireshis Hashana. If you notice again, Hashana, that's the Heya Yediyah, right? The definitive article, the year. Meireshis Hashana. So the Rebbe says, in the beginning of the year, what does every single person say? Meireshis, this is the year. This is going to be the year. This is my breakthrough year. And says the Rebbe, unfortunately, what happens by the end of the year? Acharis Shana. What happens by the end of the year? It's just another year. Right? It begins, the year begins with Hashana. This is it. And all too often, it just becomes another year. Such an incredible yisod, right? How many times in life do we have that epiphany? This is the year, or maybe this is the day. This is the week I'm going to turn it around. And then we come to the end of it, and we just haven't risen to the occasion. Not because we can't, just because we haven't, for a variety of different reasons. But Lamaisa, again, the goal is always to break that cycle. But such a profound yisod. The Gemara says, so, Meresh Shani Domaya B'sofa, Mimai, the Tishrei. So what's it? By the way, how do you know it's Tishrei? Right? Just again, remember, how do you know that at the end of the day, the month that's being referred to over here, that's the Rosh Hashana for Din, is Tishrei. It says, Mereish Tishrei from the beginning of the year, but how do you know the beginning of the year is Tishrei? D'chsiv, also listen to this. A pasuk can tell them, D'chsiv, Tiku b'chodesh shofar, b'kes liyom chagenu. Rabbi say, here we go. Incredible Gemara. Rabbi say, this Gemara is the essence of Rosh Hashana. Tiku b'chodesh shofar, so literally again, you should blow the shofar in the month, Bakesa liyom chagenu. Bakesa means when it is hidden in the month of our celebration, or in the day of our celebration. So what does this mean? Eizehu chag, on the base, shachodesh miskasebo. They will say, what is the only Yom Tov we have that the moon is hidden? The only Yom Tov we have the moon is hidden. Havi Omer is Rosh Hashana. It's Rosh Hashana. Because remember again, every single other Yom Tov is, again, Sukkot middle of the month, right? Pesach middle of the month, even Shavuos. Also remember again, when is Shavuos? Remember we just had this, 5, 6, or 7, right? Remember again, the Gemara said, again, it's different, we have a set calendar. 5, 6, or 7, but even then, the moon is visible already. There's only one Yom Tov where the moon is hidden. And when is that? Bakes liyom chagenu, have omer ze Rosh Hashana. It's Rosh Hashana. So I will say, that's fine, but how do you know it's a Yom Adin? Uksiv ki chok li Yisrael hu mishpat le'elokei Yaakov. And I will say, what does the next part of the pasuk say? The next pasuk in that same capital, ki chok li Yisrael hu, it'll be a statute for Yisrael, ki chok, a judgment, mishpat le'elokei Yaakov, a day of judgment for the God of Yaakov. So I will say, this is how we know that Rosh Hashana is a Yom Adin. Bakesa liyom chagenu, tiku b'chodesh shofar, blow the shofar in the particular month. Bakesa liyom chagenu, a Yom Tov where the month is hidden. Which is the Yom Tov where the moon is hidden? Ultimately, that is only Rosh Hashana. I have know it's a Yom Adin. Ki chok liYisrael hu mishpat le'elokei Yaakov. Because it is a day of judgment for Yisrael, mishpat, a day of justice, a day of mishpat for Elokei Yaakov. So Shabbos say, listen to this. Tan Rabbanan, ki chok liYisrael hu mishpat le'elokei Yaakov. It is again a chok liYisrael, a law for Yisrael. Mishpat, judgment for Elokei Yaakov. Melamed, shein bezdin shama le'nichnasin ledin, Ela imkin kitchu bezdin shalmata es hachodesh. Shabbos, so interestingly enough, what do we learn from here? We learn from here that the bezdin shalmala does not sit down to engage in judgment of humanity until bezdin shalmata, until the lower court declares the new month. We'll say, how do you know that? What's the drasha? Ki chok li Yisrael hu. It's only when Yisrael determines, chok, passes the law that it's Rosh Chodesh, mishpat lelokei Yaakov, that the God of Israel enters into judgment. So both say, isn't this incredible? That the din of Rosh Hashana does not begin until Beis Din Shalmata declares the new month. I will say, I'll tell you something fascinating about this. There is, when it's not for now, but if it was for now, what I would tell you is as follows. There is a fascinating machlokes in halacha about if you forget to say, right? Normally we have a lot of insertions for Yamim Noraim. So most of them you don't have to go back for. What's the one you do have to go back for? Hamelech HaKadosh. What happens if you didn't say Hamelech HaKadosh by Ma'ariv of Rosh Hashana night? Is there an obligation to go ahead and go back or not? So the majority of poskim say yes. There's a minority opinion that says no, based on the Gemara. Because remember again, could Beis Din declare the new month that night? No, this is why, by the way, we know this. All of us know this, and we've all used this. Right? When have we used this? When you forget Ya'aleh v'yavo on Ma'ariv on Rosh Chodesh. You don't go back. Why? Because Beis Din can't declare the new month that night, and therefore if I forget Ya'aleh v'yavo, which is I don't have to go back. So there is a school of thought that says that if you forget Hamelech HaKadosh on the night of Rosh Hashanah, you don't have to go back. Because since ultimately Din, which is Hamelech HaKadosh, Hamelech, the king represents Din. Since again we, Beis Din Shalmata, cannot declare the new month at night, so to Beis Din Shalmala cannot sit in judgment at night. And therefore, if you forget Hamelech HaKadosh, which is the din of Beis Din Shalmala at night, you don't have to go back. Now, we don't paskin that way, but it is a fascinating approach. So the Gemara goes weiter. Tanya Idach, another approach. Ki chok li Yisrael hu. Einli ela li Yisrael. I only know, though, that Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment for the Jewish people. Le'umo sa'ola minayin. How do I know that Rosh Hashanah is also a day of judgment for the nations of the world? Tamalomar, mishpat lelokei Yaakov. It is a mishpat ultimately again for the God of Yaakov. So we'll say it's very interesting that the Gemara understands this piece to be a reference to a general universal judgment of humanity. Which means that Kichok li Yisrael is a day of judgment for Yisrael, mishpat lelokei Yaakov. Ultimately references to the rest of humanity. Imkein, ma tamulomar Kichok li Yisrael. So we'll say, so one second. If Mishpat Lelokei Yaakov means that God judges all of humanity, Klal Yisrael is also included in all of humanity. So once you're telling me that God judges all of humanity, including the Jewish people, then what do I need the phrase of what? Ki chok li Yisrael. What does that do for me? So the Gemara says, Melamed she'Yisrael nichnasen tchila ledin. It teaches us, Rabbi say, that on the stage of universal judgment, Klal Yisrael is judged first. Kidichsiv. As the pasuk, Kidirav Chista, Damrav Chista, Melech v'tzibor. Rabbi say both the king and the congregation need to be judged. Melech nichnas tchila. The king goes in for judgment first. Melech nichnas tchila l'din. Shneimar mishpat avdo u'mishpat amo. The pasuk says again, first the king, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges the king, mishpat amo, avdo, his servant, which refers to the king, u'mishpat amo, and then the judgment of his nation. So therefore, again, what turns out it's another drush over here. Ki chok li Yisrael means Kadosh Baruch Hu first judges Am Yisrael, mishpat lelokei Yaakov, and then ultimately judges the rest of humanity as well. So the Gemara says, because just like if a king and the tzibor and the congregation have to be judged, HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges the king first and then the tzibor, so too on the universal stage or on the global stage, HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges Am Yisrael first and then the nations of the world. Gemara says, by the way, my time, why is it that when the king needs to be judged and the nation needs to be judged, that the king is judged before the nation? So possibility one is it's not appropriate to keep the king waiting. In other words, if the king needs to be judged, that doesn't make sense. And on both sides, he's also talking about like a literal judgment. If Beis Din has to adjudicate the case of the king and the case of the nation, right? We adjudicate the case of the king first. It's why possibility number one is it's not right to keep the king waiting. The other possibility is we want the king to be judged before HaKadosh Baruch Hu's anger flares up at the nation. When the Rebbe Shalom has to look at the iniquity of the nation, his anger may flare up. We would like the king, who represents the Am, ultimately again to be judged before that intensity of divine wrath. So we're gonna speak a lot more about the judgment aspect ultimately of Rosh Hashana. But what I do want to point out is that halacha l'maisa, this is the makar for Rosh Hashana as a Yom Adin. Remember again, the Torah makes absolutely no reference to Rosh Hashana as a day of judgment. Absolutely. All the Torah speaks about Rosh Hashana is Yom Zichron Trua. Yom Trua tells us about Shofar, right? Tells us about Karbanos. Makes absolutely no reference, not a single reference to the concept that Rosh Hashana is a day of judgment. Where do we know that Rosh Hashana is a day of judgment? It's Meseches Rosh Hashana, Daf Ches Amud Aleph. It is based on two psukim. The pasuk ultimately in Dvarim, Meireshis Hashana Vad Acheres Hashana, which teaches us that in the beginning of the year, HaKadosh Baruch Hu determines what is going to happen at the end of the year, but I still don't know when the beginning of the year is. Comes along David HaMelech, Tiku B'chodesh Shofar, B'kesel Yom Chagenu. We blow the shofar ultimately again on the Yom Tiv, when the moon is hidden. What's the Yom Tiv the moon is hidden? That's Rosh Hashana. And how do I know that it's a day of judgment? I both said this is all Tehillim Pei Aleph. So chapter 81 in Tehillim. Ki chok liYisrael hu mishpat leElokei Yaakov. Because it is a day of judgment for Klal Yisrael, a day of judgment for all humanity. This is how we know Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Adin. And Rabbi said, just point out that the Rambam quotes this, right? The Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, Perek Gimel Halacha Gimel. So the Rambam writes, Bekach b'chol shana v'shana, shok l'navonos kol echa v'echa b'olam m'schuyosav, b'yom tov shal Rosh Hashanah. Every single year, what happens? HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes ahead and literally shoklan means he weighs. He weighs the averos, he weighs the mitzvahs. So again, the Rambam goes on, Mishnim Tzaddik, good. So I'll just point out something fascinating. Because you'll look at this on your own, but this is the Rambam Gimel, Hilchos Tshuva. The Rambam never calls Rosh Hashana a Yom Adin. He doesn't call it a Yom Adin. He speaks out what happens on Rosh Hashana, but it doesn't call Yom Adin. The Torah never calls it a Yom Hadin, a day of judgment. What's the pshat? Right? Everything is determined on Rosh Hashana. Right? Chaye, Bani, Parnasa, everything is determined on Rosh Hashana. How could the Torah be absolutely silent on the fact that it is a day on which everything is determined? And perhaps the Kadosh Baruch Hu is trying to teach us an incredible lesson. You see, din, the concept of judgment, that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does. Right? That's the purview of the Ribono Shel Olam. It's interesting that when you continue to look in the Gemara, we're going to see that the essence of Rosh Hashanah is really Malchias, the concept of coronating HaKadosh Baruch Hu, accepting him as our king, which we'll get to. Din, perhaps, is not really mentioned in the Torah, and it's the Rambam himself doesn't really mention it, or doesn't use that word din, because again, as a Jew, our job is not to focus on what God is doing. Our job is to be focused on what we're doing. See, this yisod of like Chizkiyo, the Navi Yeshayahu says to Chizkiyo, "Ba'adei kavshei derachmana lamalach." Why are you getting involved in the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs His world? We spend so much time trying to figure out why does God do this and why does God do that, and what happens even after you engage in that exhaustive process of trying to figure out why God does what He does. You always come up short. See, this is in general why you should know, I've mentioned this before, Judaism doesn't really believe in philosophy all that much. We have a body of philosophy, but that was really because we saw that other religions were developing bodies of philosophy as well. Because philosophy is profound, but it doesn't necessarily always give you clarity, especially on theological matters. And therefore, again, Judaism is an actional religion. Yiddishkeit says, don't worry about how God is running His world, because He's God. You're not going to understand it. Worry about you. Worry about how you're running your life. Worry about how you're running your day. Worry about how you are becoming the best version of you. Din is something HaKadosh Baruch Hu does. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu Kiviyachal says, I'm not including this Torah. What's the point of the Torah? What's the point of the Torah? What is the point of the Torah, Kedosha? To teach us how to live. Knowing how God runs His world is not part of how we live. Trusting God to run His world the right way, that's what we do. That's called emunah. So Kadosh Baruch Hu doesn't mention din by Rosh Hashana because din is what He's doing. Don't get involved in how God is running His world. Don't worry about it because guess what? I'm not going to understand it anyway. So to a certain degree, it is a theological exercise in futility. People spend their lives trying to figure out why did God do this, why did God do that, and all it leads is to terrible spiritual frustration. So Kadosh Baruch Hu says, din, I got it. Leave it to me. Leave it to me. Your job is to try to figure out how to what? Be successful in din. Right? To say, isn't that our avoda? To try to figure out then how to be a tzaddik. My job is to try to figure out how can I navigate divine judgment in a successful way. So perhaps that's why the Torah makes no mention about din. Because that's what God does. The Rambam, Hilchos Tshuva. We'll say, what's the point of Hilchos Tshuva? To allow us to be successful in the process of Tshuva. Doesn't mention din. Because that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does. Our job is not to worry about what God does. Our job is to worry about what we do. Let's go right there. Says the Gemara, Ulishmitin. Next, we're not finished with Rosh Hashana though. Ulishmitin. Next is Shemitah. Right, so remember again, the first of Tishrei is Rosh Hashana for Shmitin. So minol, and how do you know this? T'chsiv, Ubashana Hashriyas Shabbos Niela Aretz. The pasuk says in the 7th year shall be a year of rest for the land. We'll say halacha l'maisa. The Gomer Shana Mitishrei, and we make a Gzer Shav of Shana of Tishrei. T'chsiv Mereishes Hashana. So the Gemara says Mereishes Hashana. So just like it says by Shemitah, Bashana Hashriyas. And it says, by Tishrei, this is Rosh we just had, Meireshis Hashana. So Shana, right? So they're just like Meireshis Hashana is Tishrei, like we just proved. So too again, Shana by Shemitah is also Tishrei. To teach me that, so Shemitah begins in Tishrei. V'ligmar Shana mi Nisan. Why don't you make a Gzera Shava between Shemitah and Nisan? T'chsev Rishon hu l'chadshe Hashana. It says Shana by Nisan as well. To which the Gemara says, no, done in Shana she'eni machadashin, Shana she'eni machadashin, ve'in dana Shana she'eni machadashin, Mishana she'eshim machadashin. So we'll say, here's the difference. Whenever we make a Gzera Shava, we'd rather make a Gzera Shava between two things that are the most similar. So I will say, while it's true that you have Shana by Nisan also, that Shana is accompanied by what? A mention of Chodesh. So therefore, again, by Shemitah, there's no mention of Chodesh. By Tishrei, right, Meresh Shana, there's no mention of Chodesh. So therefore, we'd rather compare two Shanas where there's no mention of Chodesh and not compare a Shana where there is no mention of Chodesh to a Shana where there is a mention of Chodesh. Therefore, I will say, that's how we learn that Tishrei is the Rosh Hashana for Shemitah. Ultimately, again, it is a Gzera Shava between Shemitah and between Tishrei. Beautiful. Uli Ovlos. Next, I will say, Tishrei is also the Rosh Hashana for Yovel. Here we go. Yovel's be'echa b'Tishrei. Is that true? That Yovel begins on the 1st of Tishrei? But Yud b'Tishrei. Both say it's not true. Actually, Yovel begins when? The 10th of Tishrei, which is Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur. Dichsiv. B'Yom HaKippurim. Ta'aviru shofar. Both the pasuk says that on Yom Kippur you shall sound the shofar, and it's the blowing of that shofar that ultimately again does what? Sets all the slaves free, and returns ancestral lands to their rightful owners. So what do you mean that the 1st of Tishrei is Rosh Hashana for Yovel? It's the 10th of Tishrei, to which the Gemara says, listen to this. So the Gemara says, what's an incredible Gemara? Who's the pain does this reflect? Rabbi Shmuel Sar Yochanan ben Baroka. Disanya. Here we go. Vikidash l'mishnasa chamishim. First white line about Seich Chesed days. You should go ahead and sanctify the 50th year. Ma Talmud Lomar. What is that coming to teach me? Lefi shene'emar b'Yom HaKippurim. Since the pasuk says b'Yom HaKippurim taviru shofar, you might have thought Yachol lo te mikudeshes el Yom HaKippurim ve'ela. So I will say, you might have thought the Torah does say you should blow the shofar on Yom Kippur. You should blow the shofar on Yom Kippur. And I must remember again, the rest of the pasuk says, Tavir shofar, good. You might have thought, Lo te mikudeshes el Yom Kippurim ve'elach. You might have thought that since the Torah says, blow the shofar on the Yovel year on Yom Kippur, that when does the Yovel sanctity set in? From Yom Kippur and on. Talmud Lomar, Vikidashta Mishnasa Chamishim. Therefore the pasuk says, you shall consecrate or sanctify the 50th year. Melamed, Shemiskadeshes v'holeches mitchilasa. It teaches you that Yovel is actually sanctified from the beginning, from the first of Tishrei. Now, we'll say, so how does this shtim? So what's going on over here? Right, I have one pasuk that teaches me, V'kidash Mishnasa Chamishim, which says the entire Yovel year from the first of Tishrei is consecrated. But yet, the shofar is only sounded on Yom Kippur. So what's the pshat? Rabbi say, this is incredible. So based on this, Rabbi Yishmael said it's the following construct. Here we go. Rosh Hashana ad Yom Kippurim, lo hayu avadim niftarim lebateihen, v'lo mishtabdim la'adoneihen. Rabbi say, listen to this. From the first of Tishrei, Rosh Hashana of the Yovel year, the slaves, right, the avadim, right, these are avadim ivrim, right, these are Jewish slaves. The Jewish slaves would not go home. They wouldn't go home yet, but they also were not working for their masters. So what were they doing between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? Ela ochlin vishosin, they would eat, they would drink, usmeichin, they would celebrate, va'atarosehem berashehem, their crowns were on their head. Now what does the crowns were on there? Look at Rashi. Va'atarosehem berashehem, imrotza losum, atara berosho, larosh yetzachavshi. If the slave wants to put on a crown to show that he's free, he has the right to do so. Watch this. Kevan shegi Yom Kippurim, once Yom Kippur came, Taku Beis Din Bashofar, ultimately again Beis Din blew the shofar, Nifteru Avadim Lebatehen. At that shofar Yom Kippur, then the slaves would go home, V'chsados Chozos Leba'alehen. And ultimately, again, fields would return back to their original owners. So therefore, Rabbi Shmuel ben Yochai ben Beroka says, based on this is how he reconciles the two psukim. The pasuk says, sanctify the 50th year, which means that Yovel is sanctified as a Tishrei. But yet the shofar is only sounded as of Yom Kippur. So what's going on? So says the Gemara, in the beginning of the 50th year, the slaves are free, but they don't go home. Instead, what happens? They eat, they drink, they celebrate, they wear their crown if they want to, and they rejoice. Where? We'll say, where are they rejoicing? Where? In their master's home. In their master's home. Comes the shofar of Rosh Hashana, of Yom Kippur, the Bo shofar in Yom Kippur, they go home, fields are returned. That's how we reconcile ultimately again the two psukim. So I will say, I will tell you, the Rambam codifies this halacha. So the Rambam writes, this is in Hilchos Shemitah v'Yovel, Perek Yud, Halacha Yud Daled. This is it. So the Rambam writes, he says, Rosh Hashana Yom Kippurim, lo hayu avadim niftarim lebateihen, v'lo mishal ladoneihem. They would not go home, but ultimately again, they also were not enslaved. V'lo asados chos ela, avadim ochlin, it's close to the Gemara, avadim ochlin, v'shosim usmechim ba'atarosem berashehem. They would rejoice. Big party, 10-day party in the home of their master, all expense paid. Kevin she'egi Yom Kippurim tako beis shofar niftra v'lo atem chosel. So we'll say this is how the Rambam Paskin's halacha l'maisa. We'll say, what's the pshat? What's the pshat of this? So we'll say, listen to how profound Rabbi Shmuel is saying is like this. This Eved was an Eved for how long? Who knows how long? Remember, if he's only going free during Yovel, it's also, again, it's possible that he just became an Eved over the last couple of years, and Yovel is his Shemitah, so to speak. It's also possible that he signed up for prolonged service. Now he has to go home and resume life as a free man. We'll say, to transition from being an Eved to being a Ben Chorin is not a simple thing. You tell someone 1 minute that they're an Eved, and the next minute they're free, and go about life as a free man, with achrayas, with responsibility, with a personalistic mission, is not such a pasha thing. We know it's not pasha. They will say, I forgot the legal term, when criminals repeat crimes again? Recidivism, right? So say, people are shocked. People get out of jail, and they go right back to a life of crime. Really? You're shocked? Who's the fool who created the system to begin with? You keep people in a box for prolonged amounts of time, then you set them free into general society, and you think that people who, again, some of them committed the worst kind of crimes, you think they're going to learn how to be a Ben Chorin? You think that a person knows how to acclimate to free life just like that? Who knows how long living a life of a slave, living a life of a prisoner, and suddenly become Ben Chorin? So the halacha understands this. The halacha understands that we want this guy to reintegrate into society. We want this Eved to become a true Ben Chorin. We want this Eved to once again become a functional part of society. We want him to become a Baal Achrayus. We want him to become a person with a mission. So what do you do? What do you do? You set him free, Rosh Hashana Yovel, and then what do you do for 10 days? For 10 days, he is sitting at the table with who? With his master. But not as a servant, as an equal. As an equal. And they're sitting together, and there's someone else serving him now. And he wants to put on a crown, put on a crown. You can even hold the scepter and a cape if you want, right? You can do whatever you want, right? For 10 days, you are going to sit and dine with your master. For 10 days, you are going to become an equal with your master. So that the hope is that after that shofar blows on Yom Kippur, you go home with your head held high. You go home being rehabilitated. You go home with a true feeling of being a Ben Chorin. You can't just pluck the Eved from his Avdus, put him back in his former life, and expect him to regain everything that he had lost. Take the time to rehabilitate him. Take the time to reinstill within him that sense of chesed. And I will say, I think it's an incredible yesod for life as well. Because a lot of times, we all undergo different forms of avdos. Right? We have different difficulties or traumatic experiences in life. And what we sometimes don't realize is, those traumatic experiences, they chip away at our sense of self. I no longer feel like a whole person. And sometimes the way to kind of get back on my feet is not just to go ahead and stop sinning or to stop engaging in a negative thing, but to rehabilitate a sense of self. Because so many of us walk through life with a diminished sense of self. We don't believe in ourselves. Sometimes we don't even like ourselves because of things that we've done. And we think if we just stop doing the thing or just start doing better things, we're okay. Sometimes, again, we really need help restoring our sense of self. The Eved needs help restoring his sense of self. That's why he doesn't go home on Aleph Tishrei. He needs 10 days. Rehabilitate the sense of self. Feel good about yourself. And then you're ready to reintegrate. You're ready to resume. You're ready to once again become a Ben Chorin. V'Rabbanan, we'll say last piece of V'Rabbanan. We'll just finish. We'll another minute. V'Rabbanan, Shanim ata mekadesh yata mekadesh chadashim. The Rabbanan will say that ultimately, what do we learn from this? We learn from this that we consecrate years, but we do not consecrate months. So I'll say, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Shanim ata mekadesh kishishnas yovel nichneses mitzvah al beis din lomar mikudeshes hashana. That when ultimately, again, the 50th year comes, the yovel year comes, beis din has an obligation to declare the year sanctified. In other words, we'll say, they're dashing over v'kidashtem es shnas hachamishim. The Rabbanan will say means beis din has an obligation to say the year is consecrated. That is their obligation to say that. V'yata mekadesh chadashim, Rashi says, v'yata mekadesh chodesh kol Elazar v'shim damar kamam parak sheni ben sher b'zman v'shalom b'zmano in mekadshin also v'elav tamecha. So we'll say we're going to see that there's a position that says the only time beis din is really obligated to go out and sanctify anything is the year of Yovel. But there's not necessarily an obligation to go out and sanctify each and every month. Right? So we'll stop over here. We're not finished with this conversation, but Amir Hashem will pick up. There's another brayso we'll say. And again, I just want to point out, this is only the beginning of our journey into the identity of Rosh Hashana as well. Don't think we're finished with it. Amir Hashem will come back to some really beautiful sugyas. Let's say what an incredible way to start the week. Yashakach, have a wonderful day, everyone.